April 1204. The Fourth Crusade has just sacked Constantinople. Not Jerusalem, not Antioch, not any city held by the enemies of Christianity. Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the empire that, 109 years earlier, had sent a letter to the Pope asking for help. That letter had asked for soldiers, for mercenaries, for a relatively small military force that could help stabilize the eastern frontier of the Christian world. What the letter produced over the course of 4 crusades, 2 centuries of warfare, and the systematic breakdown of the relationship between Western and Eastern Christendom was this. The burning of the city, the letter was written to save. The sack of Constantinople in 1204 was so thorough, so complete in its destruction of the accumulated wealth and scholarship of 9 centuries that historians still debate whether Byzantine civilization ever fully recovered. It did not fall to the Ottomans until 1453, but the damage done in 1204 by Christian armies had already broken something that could not be repaired. The letter that started all of this was sent in 1095. It asked for mercenaries. It got a crusade, and this a burning city, a shattered alliance. 2 Christian civilizations at each other's throats is what a crusade, unleashed and uncontrolled, eventually produces when it outlives the intentions of the man who wrote the letter that called it into being. Alexios I became Emperor of Byzantium in 1081. He was, by any measure, one of the most capable rulers in the history of the empire, a military commander of genuine skill, a political operator of considerable intelligence, a man who had inherited a state on the verge of collapse and had, through 20 years of patient and resourceful statecraft, stabilized it considerably. He had defeated the Normans, who were threatening from the west. He had managed the Pecheneg threat from the north. He had contained, if not reversed, the Seljuk pressure from the east. He was not a man who panicked. He was not a man who exaggerated his situation to anyone he did not think could be useful to him. And in 1095, he wrote a letter to the West. The specific content of Alexios's letter, the original letter, in his own words, does not survive. This is the first and most important thing to understand about this episode. The foundational document, the letter that began the chain of events leading to the First Crusade, to the capture of Jerusalem, to the eventual sack of Constantinople, does not exist in its original form. We have summaries. We have paraphrases. We have second-hand accounts of what the letter said. We have the letter's effects, the responses it produced, the actions it generated, from which we can reconstruct, with reasonable confidence, its general content. But the original is gone, which means that from the very beginning, from the very source document, at the root of this episode, we are dealing not with what Alexios wrote, but with what people said he wrote, with the letter as it was received, transmitted, amplified, and transformed by the people who read it, retold it, and acted on it. The letter that launched the Crusades was not a forgery. It was something in some ways, more interesting than a forgery. It was a real document that became something completely different from what it was as it passed through the hands of the people who read it. What did Alexios's letter actually say, based on the historical sources available to us, primarily the accounts of the Byzantine historian Anna Komnene, Alexios's own daughter, writing in her biography of her father called the Alexiad, and based on the responses the letter generated and the context of Byzantine military and diplomatic practice, historians have reconstructed the general content with reasonable confidence. Alexios needed soldiers. Specifically, he needed Western Knights, professional fighters, heavily armed, experienced in the cavalry warfare that the Seljuk Turks were particularly vulnerable to. He needed them as mercenaries, men who would fight for pay, men who would serve under Byzantine command in Byzantine territory. For Byzantine strategic objectives, he wanted a specific thing, a few thousand professional fighters who could help him reclaim territory in Anatolia that the Seljuk Turks had taken in the wake of Manzikert. He was not asking for the liberation of Jerusalem. Jerusalem had been under Muslim control in various forms since 637. It had not been a Byzantine possession for 4.5 centuries. Its recovery was not Alexios's objective. He was not asking for a holy war. He was asking for a labor contract. He was asking, in effect, for what any employer asks for when they need skilled workers they cannot produce themselves. Please send me some of your people. I will tell them what to do. I will pay them. They will work for me. This is not a religious appeal. It is a diplomatic and commercial one. The letter that reached Pope Urban III in Omianos was not that letter. The transformation of Alexios's letter happened in stages. The first stage was translation, literal and figurative. Alexios wrote in Greek. His letter would have been translated into Latin before it reached most Western recipients. Translation is never neutral. Every choice of Latin equivalent for a Byzantine Greek term involves judgment, involves the translator's sense of what the original meant, of what the recipient needs to hear, of how to convey not just the words, but the urgency that the words were meant to carry. A translator who understood that his job was to persuade a Western Latin-speaking audience to take action, not merely to inform them, would make different choices than a translator whose only concern was accuracy. The second stage was summary. Alexios's letter was long. The people who would ultimately hear its contents, including Pope Urban II, would receive summaries, not the full text. Summaries require selection. Selection requires judgment. What do you emphasize? What do you leave out? What context do you provide? A summary written by someone who wanted action taken would emphasize the crisis, would foreground the suffering, would select the details that create urgency. A summary written by someone whose only concern was accuracy might be so measured in its tone as to produce no response at all. The third stage was context. Pope Urban II was not reading Alexios's letter in a vacuum. He was reading it in the context of his own political and ecclesiastical situation, a situation in which a crusade served his interests in ways that a mercenary contract with a Byzantine emperor did not. Urban II had spent his papacy in conflict with the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, the same emperor who had, 20 years earlier, driven Urban's predecessor, Gregory VII, from Rome. The papacy was weakened. Its authority over secular rulers, the authority the donation of Constantine was supposed to guarantee, was contested and fragile. A crusade would change that. A crusade would be called by the Pope, led by armies owing their spiritual mandate to the Pope, fighting a war defined by the Pope as the will of God. A crusade would make Urban II the most consequential figure in Western Christendom, not merely a bishop locked in a dispute with an emperor, but the man who had called Christendom to arms, in defense of the faith. Alexios's letter arrived at the moment when Urban II needed precisely the kind of crisis the letter could be made to describe. The letter did not have to be forged. It only had to be read by the right man, in the right context, at the right moment. A man who had reasons to hear in it more than was written. Before we follow Urban II to Clermont, we need to understand one more dimension of Alexios' situation, because it explains something that is otherwise difficult to account for. Alexios knew he was asking the West. He understood Western Latin Christendom well enough to know that the relationship between Byzantium and Rome was not simple. The Great Schism of 1054, the formal break between the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church, had occurred 40 years earlier. The two churches were in formal schism. The Pope and the Patriarch of Constantinople were not in communion. Alexios was asking for help from a church that considered his church to be in theological error. He was asking for military assistance from a pope whose ecclesiastical authority he did not recognize. He did this anyway, because he needed the soldiers, because he calculated, as a sophisticated diplomat, that the benefits outweighed the theological complications. What he miscalculated, what could not have been predicted from Constantinople in 1095, with the information available to him, was the specific political situation of Urban II, was the specific hunger of a papacy that needed exactly this kind of crisis to re-establish its authority, was the specific religious atmosphere of Western Europe in the 1090s, the particular combustible combination of piety, anxiety, and martial culture that would turn a diplomatic request into a mass movement. Alexios sent a letter to a specific person with a specific request. He did not know that his letter would be read at a council in Clermont to an audience of thousands. Did not know that the council would overflow, that Urban II's address would have to be moved outdoors because no building was large enough to contain the crowd. Did not know that the response to the letter he had carefully written to request a manageable military force would be an outpouring of popular religiosity that produced an army he had not ordered, could not command, and could barely direct. He asked for mercenaries. He got the First Crusade. There is a document, not Alexios' original letter, but a letter dated to around 1090, written by Alexios to Count Robert I of Flanders, that gives us the clearest available picture of how Byzantine diplomatic appeals to the West were framed. This letter is preserved and is the closest thing we have to authentic Alexian language in the context of appeals for Western help. It is worth examining, not because it is typical of every appeal Alexios made, but because of what it reveals about the rhetorical choices available to a Byzantine diplomat writing for a Western audience. The letter to Robert of Flanders describes, in vivid and disturbing terms, the suffering of Christians in the East. It describes atrocities. It describes violations of churches and Christian people. It uses language designed to provoke moral outrage in a Western Christian reader. Historians have debated the accuracy of these descriptions. Some of what the letter describes appears to be exaggerated. Some of it may be fabricated, designed not to report what was happening, but to produce a specific response. The letter to Robert worked. Robert of Flanders did send 500 knights to Byzantium, a manageable force, the kind of assistance Alexios actually needed. But the letter also became a model, a template for how to appeal to Western Christendom, how to frame a military request, in the language of religious crisis. And when Alexios wrote to Urban D in 455, or when his ambassadors summarized his appeal to Urban IV in 55, they may well have drawn on the same template, the language of crisis, the language of suffering Christians, the language of a faith under existential threat, written to produce action, producing much more action than anyone had planned for. The Council of Clermont was called for November 1095. Urban II had been touring France since August, a rare papal journey north of the Alps, itself a signal that something significant was being prepared. The Council's official agenda included routine ecclesiastical business, the reform of clerical behavior, the Peace of God movement, regulation of feudal violence among the lords of France. The crusade was not on the official agenda. This was deliberate. Urban II wanted the announcement to land with maximum impact, wanted it to emerge from the council as a response to the crisis that had just been described, not as a prearranged program that had been negotiated in advance. He wanted it to feel like inspiration, to feel like the spontaneous movement of the Holy Spirit through an assembled body of the faithful. The performance of spontaneity is itself a form of information management. The Council at Clermont was, in this sense, staged on November 27. Urban II addressed the Council on the subject of the East. We know this happened. We know it produced an extraordinary response. We know that the crowd, which had overflowed outdoors to hear the Pope speak, erupted in the cry, Deus vult, God wills it, that would become the watchword of the crusading movement. We know all of this. What we do not know, what has been lost, or was never recorded with fidelity, or was deliberately obscured, is exactly what Urban II said. Alexios I was in Constantinople when the Council of Clermont met. He did not attend. He was not invited. This was not his council, not his church, not his pope. He was in Constantinople, waiting to hear what had been decided about the request he had sent west some months before. The reports that reached him in the weeks and months after Clermont described something he had not requested, had not planned for, had not wanted. Not a few thousand mercenaries, a mass movement, not employees answering to him, crusaders answering to God and to the Pope, who had defined what God wanted. He had written a letter. Someone else had read it, and now an army was coming. The 5 accounts of Urban II's speech at Clermont were written by Fulcher of Chartres, a cleric who was present at the council and later participated in the First Crusade. He wrote his account of the speech some years later, probably between 1101 and 1106. Robert the Monk, a monk who wrote a history of the First Crusade around 1107. He claims to have been present at Clermont. His account of the speech is the longest and most dramatic of the 5. Baldric of Bourgueil, an abbot and later archbishop, who wrote his account around 1107, 1108. He was almost certainly present at Clermont. Guibert of Nogent, an abbot who wrote his history of the crusade around 1108. He was almost certainly not present at Clermont. William of Malmesbury, an English chronicler who wrote his account around 1125. He was definitely not present. He was writing in England 30 years after the speech, based on sources he does not name. These 5 accounts do not agree on what the speech said about conditions in the East, what specific actions Urban II called for, what he offered to participants in the way of spiritual reward, what he said about the specific enemies to be fought, and, most significantly, what he said about Jerusalem. This last point matters enormously, because the crusade that actually resulted from Clermont had Jerusalem as its central objective, the liberation of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the holiest site in Christendom, and it is not clear from the 5 available accounts that Urban II mentioned Jerusalem at all in his speech, or if he did, how prominently, whether it was a primary objective or a secondary one, whether it was the goal or a destination. The movement that captured Jerusalem in 1099 may have had, at its origin, a speech that barely mentioned Jerusalem, or may have had a speech that placed Jerusalem at its center. We do not know, because the speech was not written down while it was being given, and the 5 accounts that were written afterward cannot agree. Let us take the 5 accounts and work with what they share, because the accounts do share elements, points of convergence, that appear across multiple versions, and that historians use to reconstruct the probable content of what Urban actually said. Point 1. The appeal on behalf of Eastern Christians. All 5 accounts agree that Urban II spoke about Christians in the East, about suffering, about oppression, about the need to help fellow members of the faith, the specific nature and scale of that suffering, the specific descriptions of atrocities vary significantly between accounts. Robert the Monk's version includes graphic descriptions of violence against Christians that are not present in the more restrained account of Fulcher of Charters. Whether these descriptions were in Urban's actual speech or were added by Robert for rhetorical effect cannot now be determined. What can be said? Urban spoke about Eastern Christians. He may have described their situation in more measured terms than the most dramatic accounts suggest. He may have been more graphic than the most restrained accounts suggest. The truth is somewhere in the middle, and we cannot know exactly where. Point 2. The call to arms. All 5 accounts agree that Urban called for military action, that he asked those present to take up arms and go east. The specific framework of that call, whether it was explicitly a holy war, a pilgrimage, a military expedition, or some combination, is disputed between accounts. The concept of a pilgrimage in arms appears in multiple versions. The idea that going on crusade would count as a pilgrimage, with all the spiritual benefits that a pilgrimage carried. This concept is important because it is what gave the crusading movement its mass appeal, what made it something that involved not just knights, but large numbers of non-combatants, poor people, women, priests, the People's Crusade that departed months before the main military force and was destroyed almost entirely in Anatolia before it even arrived. Point 3. The spiritual reward. All 5 accounts agree that Urban offered some form of spiritual benefit to those who went on crusade. The specific nature of that benefit, whether it was an indulgence in the technical theological sense, a remission of penance, a guarantee of salvation, or something more ambiguous, is one of the most debated questions in the historiography of the Crusades. What the crowd heard, what the thousands of people standing in the cold in Clermont understood Urban to be offering, may have been considerably more expansive than what Urban intended to promise. The gap between what the speaker says and what the audience hears is a recurring problem in the history of mass movements. Urban II understood rhetoric. He understood that his audience would respond more enthusiastically to a generous offer than to a technically precise one. He may have deliberately left his offer ambiguous, allowing different listeners to hear in it what they needed to hear. If he did, the ambiguity worked. The crowd heard what it needed to hear, and the crowd went on crusade. The people's crusade departed first. This is one of the consequences of Clermont that Urban II most certainly did not plan for, and that Alexios I most certainly did not want. In the months after Clermont, as the message of the speech spread through France and then across Western Europe, the appeal reached beyond the knights and lords that Urban II had been addressing. It reached the poor. It reached the dispossessed. It reached people for whom the specific promises of the crusading appeal, forgiveness of sins, a chance at glory, escape from a grinding present, were even more compelling than they were for the nobility. Peter the Hermit, a charismatic preacher of obscure origins, organized a movement of common people and set off for Jerusalem in the spring of 1096. Months before the main military force was ready to depart, the People's Crusade numbered in the tens of thousands. Estimates vary widely, but the force was enormous and almost entirely unequipped for serious warfare. It passed through the Rhineland and committed atrocities against Jewish communities there, the specific logic of the blood libel that we examined in episode 3, contributing, in this context, to the violence that accompanied the Crusades' passage through Europe. The Crusaders were going to fight the enemies of Christianity in the East. The Jews living among them were, in the theology of the most extreme participants, also enemies of Christianity. The enemy was here. Why wait until Jerusalem? Urban II had not intended this. He had not called for violence against European Jews. The specific logic by which a crusade against Islam in the East became a pogrom against Jews in the Rhineland was not in his speech. It was in the movement that the speech had created, the movement that was larger than the speech, that had been joined by people to whom the speech's specific nuances and ecclesiastical limits had not been communicated. The People's Crusade reached Alexios' territory in the summer of 1096. Alexios, surveying the tens of thousands of poorly armed, undisciplined, and extremely enthusiastic pilgrims who had arrived at his border, people who were not soldiers, who were not what he had asked for, who were consuming resources he did not have, moved them across the Bosphorus into Anatolia as quickly as he could. In Anatolia, the Seljuk Turks destroyed them, almost all of them, in a few hours. The People's Crusade, which had set out in the spring to liberate Jerusalem, was over by October. It had not reached the boundaries of Syria. It had not come within 1,000 miles of Jerusalem. It had died in Anatolia. 6 months after leaving Europe, Urban II had not planned this. Alexios had not wanted this. Nobody had intended the People's Crusade. It had emerged from the speech the way consequences emerge from messages that have been amplified beyond the control of the people who sent them. The message said, "Go east." The people went. The infrastructure wasn't there. The training wasn't there. The command wasn't there. The message was, and the message was enough. The main military force of the First Crusade, the force that actually reached the Levant and captured Jerusalem, departed in autumn 1096 and arrived at Constantinople in the winter of 1096-1097. The encounter between the crusading leaders and Alexios I at Constantinople is one of the most revealing and most uncomfortable moments of the whole enterprise. Alexios had, now, understood exactly what he had received in response to his appeal. He had received not mercenaries, but an army of nobles, each of whom had their own agenda, their own political ambitions, their own understanding of what the crusade was for. He had received men who believed they were on a holy mission, which meant they answered, ultimately, not to him, but to God, or to the Pope, or to their own interpretation of what God and the Pope required. He had received men who believed that the lands they were going to capture in the East were theirs to keep, not his to recover. Not Byzantine territories to be returned to Byzantine sovereignty, but Crusader territories to be governed by Crusaders. Alexios's original request had assumed a specific transaction. He would provide support and logistics. The mercenaries would fight under his command. The captured territory would revert to him. The crusading leaders had a completely different understanding. They were not mercenaries. They were crusaders. The land they captured was the Lord's, and they were the Lord's warriors. The negotiation at Constantinople in the winter of 1096-1097 produced a series of oaths, crusading leaders swearing to return captured territory to Alexios, and most of them had no intention of keeping. The oaths were sworn. The crusade continued south. The territory was captured, and the territory was kept. Antioch, Edessa, Jerusalem, Byzantine territory, or territory that Alexios considered Byzantine, captured by crusaders and governed by crusaders. The transaction Alexios had proposed did not happen. The transaction that happened was one that nobody had proposed. Nobody had planned, and nobody had the power to prevent, because the movement was larger than any transaction, because the letter had been read by more people than it was written for, because what arrived at Constantinople was not what had been requested. It was what the message had actually produced. The First Crusade captured Jerusalem on July 15. The campaign that produced this result, 3 years of brutal warfare through Anatolia, Syria, and Palestine, was, by the standards of medieval warfare, an extraordinary military achievement. It should not be minimized as a military accomplishment. The distances involved, the logistical challenges, the military opposition encountered. Any serious military historian acknowledges that what the First Crusade accomplished between 1096 and 1099 was remarkable. What was also accomplished, what the letters and chronicles of the crusading participants recorded with considerably less enthusiasm than the military victories, was a massacre. When Jerusalem fell on July 15, the population of the city, Muslim, Jewish, and Eastern Christian, was subjected to large-scale killing. The crusading chroniclers record this. They record it with, in many cases, what appears to be satisfaction, the streets flowing with blood, the enemies of Christ destroyed, the holy city cleansed. The Arabic sources recorded differently. The Jewish sources recorded differently. The Eastern Christian sources, the sources of the people who were nominally on the same side as the Crusaders, recorded differently. 4 different perspectives on the same event. The event itself unambiguous. People were killed. Many people in a city that the crusade had been called to liberate. Whether this was an atrocity or a military necessity or a religious act depended entirely on who was writing the letter home. The letters that the Crusaders sent home from the Holy Land during and after the campaign are among the most important primary sources for the First Crusade. They are also among the most carefully shaped. These letters were written by educated men, nobles, clerics, military commanders who understood that they were producing a historical record, who understood that the people receiving the letters had sent sons, brothers, husbands, and needed to understand that those sons, brothers, husbands had died or lived for something real, for something holy, for something that justified the suffering and the distance and the years away. The letters are not lies. They are advocacy. They are written by people who believed what they were doing was right and who wrote home to people who needed to believe the same thing. The specific details that make it into the letters, the miracles witnessed on the march, the divine interventions that turned battles, the signs' importance that confirmed God's favor may or may not reflect what actually happened. They reflect what the writer needed the recipient to understand, that this was God's work, that the suffering was worth it, that the ones who died for something. The letters produced a specific understanding of the crusade in Europe, an understanding built not on the full complexity of what had actually happened, but on the filtered, shaped, advocacy-driven version that the participants sent home for their families to read. That understanding shaped the next crusade, and the one after that, and the one after that. Each crusade launched partly on the basis of what the last crusade's letters home had said, on the understanding of the crusading enterprise that those letters had constructed and transmitted, a movement built on its own correspondence, on letters written to justify what had already been done and to motivate what came next, on the specific version of events that the participants needed the people back home to believe. Clermont, November 2013. Each handling Joshua. 5 accounts of one speech, none of them written in the room, none of them identical, none of them sufficient, by themselves, to tell us exactly what Urban II said. What we know is what the speech produced. The People's Crusade, the main military force, the pogroms in the Rhineland, the oaths at Constantinople, the capture of Antioch, the capture of Jerusalem, the massacre of July 15, Yitzhenling Joshua, the establishment of the Crusader states, the Second Crusade, the Third, the Fourth, 2 centuries of war, entire generations, born and dying, in the specific context, created by a speech that no one recorded accurately while it was being given. We know the speech happened. We know roughly what it said. We know precisely what it produced. The gap between what it said and what it produced. That gap is the history of the Crusades. And the gap began with a letter from Constantinople that asked for mercenaries and was read by a pope who needed something else entirely. The letters written from Jerusalem in the weeks and months after July 15, its handling Joshua, are extraordinary documents. They are extraordinary for what they contain, for the genuine emotion, the authentic religiosity, the unmistakable sense of people who believed they had just participated in something sacred, and they are extraordinary for what they do not contain. The letter written by the leaders of the First Crusade to Pope Alexios I. Urban II had died before the news arrived. Describing the capture of Jerusalem is a remarkable piece of writing. It describes the approach to the city, the Siege, the final assault, the entrance into the temple, the acts of devotion at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the prayers of thanksgiving. It describes these things with evident sincerity, with what reads as genuine spiritual experience, with the specific language of men who believed that God had guided their hands. The letter devotes considerable space to the sufferings of the march, to the thirst and hunger, the deaths of comrades, the obstacles overcome. What the letter does not describe, what occupies none of its considerable length, is what happened to the population of Jerusalem when the city fell. The massacre of July 15. 109is not in the letter, not mentioned, not euphemized, not described in religious language as purification or cleansing, simply absent. The men who wrote this letter were in the city on July 15. 109. They knew what happened. They had participated in it or witnessed it. They chose to write about the prayers at the Holy Sepulchre and not about what had happened in the streets before they got there. This is not censorship in the modern sense. This is the ordinary work of letter writing, deciding what to include, deciding what your audience needs to know, deciding what version of events serves the purposes of the account you are producing. The letter was written for the Pope, for the people of Europe, for the historical record, for everyone who had waited and prayed and sent sons and husbands to this enterprise. It was written to tell them it worked. God willed it. Jerusalem is ours. The other part of the story, what the Arabic sources describe, what the Jewish sources describe, what the Eastern Christian sources describe, was addressed to different audiences, in different languages, with different purposes. The history of the First Crusade is the history of all of these letters and documents existing simultaneously, each one telling a true account of what happened to the people the writer was writing for, and each one, taken alone, telling an incomplete story, taken together. They tell a complete story that no single letter was designed to contain. The Crusader states, in the aftermath of the First Crusade, the crusading leaders established 4 states in the Levant, the county of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the county of Tripoli, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. These were not Byzantine territories, restored to Byzantine control, as Alexios had intended. They were independent states, governed by Western nobles, under the nominal suzerainty of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Alexios protested. He cited the oath sworn at Constantinople in Omianozec, Shishapte, the oaths that the crusading leaders had given to return captured territory to Byzantine sovereignty. The crusading leaders had a different interpretation. The oaths, they argued, had been conditional, had been premised on Byzantine support that had not been provided, had been obtained under duress, had been superseded by God's evident will that these lands belong to the crusaders who had captured them. The specific theological argument that God's evident endorsement of the Crusades' military success constituted a higher authority. An oath sworn to an emperor is exactly the kind of argument that is difficult to answer through normal diplomatic channels. How do you counter the claim that God approves of what you have done? With what authority? With what evidence? Alexios tried. He argued. He negotiated. He used the diplomatic tools available to a Byzantine emperor operating in the complex political environment of the early 12th century. He recovered some territory. He did not recover most of it. The Crusader states remained. The relationship between Byzantium and the crusading movement deteriorated slowly. through decades of mutual suspicion, through specific incidents of bad faith, through the accumulation of grievances on both sides, until 1204, the Fourth Crusade. It deserves its own treatment, its own episode, its own series. What happened between 1202 and 1204 is one of the more complex and disturbing sequences in medieval history. But for the purposes of this episode, for the purposes of the arc we have been following, what matters about the Fourth Crusade can be stated briefly. The Fourth Crusade was not supposed to attack Constantinople. It was supposed to go to Egypt to attack the Ayyubid Sultanate from the south, cutting off the military capacity that had allowed Saladin to retake Jerusalem. It ended attacking Constantinople instead, through a sequence of events involving Crusader debts to Venice, a disputed Byzantine succession, the specific political calculations of the crusading leadership, and the accumulated mutual suspicion between Latins and Greeks that had been building since the First Crusade. None of these individual steps was inevitable. At each stage, different decisions could have been made. At each stage, a different outcome was possible. But the accumulated weight of a century of interaction, of letters, oaths, broken oaths, territorial disputes, theological differences, specific incidents of violence on both sides, created a situation in which attacking Constantinople became possible, became, in the specific logic of the Fourth Crusade's participants, justified. The theological arguments used to justify the sack of Constantinople in 1204 are variants of the same arguments that Urban II had used to justify the First Crusade. A Christian city, a Christian people, but the wrong kind of Christian, schismatic, treacherous, obstacles to the true work of Christendom, the theological infrastructure of the crusading movement, the framework that divided the world into those who were for God and those who were against him, had been applied to the wrong city, to the people who had originally asked for the crusade. The letter that asked for help had created a movement that eventually returned to the city that sent it and burned it down. Anna Komnene Alexios' daughter, the woman who wrote the Alexiad, our primary Byzantine source for this period, completed her history sometime around 1148. Alexios I had died in 1118. He died having recovered more territory than he had lost, a statesman's achievement in any era. He died having watched the crusading movement establish itself in the Levant in ways that served Byzantine interests partially and undermined them in other ways. He did not live to see 1204. He did not live to see what the movement he had helped summon eventually produced. Anna did not live to see 1204 either. She died sometime around 1153. The Alexiad, her account of her father's reign, was written in part as a history, and in part as a defense of her father, as an argument that Alexios had been wise, that his decisions had been correct, that the outcomes of the First Crusade were not his fault. She was not wrong to make these arguments. Alexios' decisions, in the context of the information available to him in 1095, were reasonable. The appeal to the West was a legitimate diplomatic move. The request was proportionate to the problem he faced. The outcomes were not proportionate to the request. The gap between the request and the outcome, the gap between the letter and what the letter produced, is not Alexios' fault in any simple sense. It is the result of the specific mechanism that this episode has been examining, the mechanism by which a message, once transmitted, is no longer controlled by the person who sent it, is shaped by every intermediary through whose hands it passes, is read by audiences for whom it was not written, is amplified by a technology, in this case, the preaching network of the medieval church, that carries it to more people than the sender intended, is received by a recipient, Urban II, who reads it through the filter of his own needs and produces from it something the sender could not have predicted. And what was produced outlived Alexios, outlived Urban II, outlived Anna Komnene, outlived the specific circumstances that had produced the original request, and in 1204, 109 years after the letter was sent, arrived in Constantinople. Alexios I Komnenos wrote a letter in 1095. We do not have the original. We have what people said it said. We have what people did because of what it said, or because of what they understood it to say, or because of what they needed it to say. The letter asked for soldiers, what it received, what its reading produced, across the specific political situation of Pope Urban II and the specific religious atmosphere of Western Europe in 1095, was a movement that Urban II shaped and directed at Clermont in a speech of which we have 5 accounts and no original, a movement that produced, in its first generation, the capture of Jerusalem and the letters home that described that capture in ways designed to make it comprehensible and holy and worth the cost. A movement that those letters helped sustain through a second generation and a third. A movement that, by its 4th generation, had turned against the city that had first called it into being. 1 letter, 4 crusades, 109 years. The city that was saved by being sacked is the oldest argument in this series for why it matters who reads your message and what they do with it. There is one more thing to account for, one more document that belongs to this episode, one more letter that completes the picture. Not a crusader letter, not an imperial letter, not a papal document, a letter from Saladin. When Saladin retook Jerusalem in October 1187, 98 years after the First Crusade had captured it, he wrote to the Caliph in Baghdad. The letter describes the recapture of the Holy City. It describes the ceremonies, the prayers, the restoration of the mosques. It does not describe a massacre. When Jerusalem fell to Saladin in 1187, the Christian population of a city, the Crusader garrison and civilians, was allowed to leave. Those who could pay a ransom ransomed those who could not. In many cases, were nonetheless allowed to go. Saladin's letter describes this with evident pride. Historians debate the full complexity of what happened. There were people enslaved. There were people who died. The full picture is not as simple as the letter suggests. But the comparison with 1099 is not the historian's point. It was Saladin's. He knew what the Crusaders had done when they took Jerusalem. He knew about July 15. He tending Joshua. He wrote his letter to be read against that letter. He wrote his letter to make a specific argument about who the civilized party in this conflict was. A letter written to be read alongside a letter written 98 years earlier. The 2 letters in conversation with each other across a century, each one shaped by its purpose, each one making its argument, each one addressed to a specific audience, with a specific message. 2 letters about the same city. 2 different cities described. Same stones. Different letters. Different truths. The city does not write letters. The people who take it and lose it write the letters. And the letters are always, at some level, about more than the city. They are about who tells the story and who gets to hear it. The First Crusade produced the Crusader states. The Crusader states produced the Second Crusade. The Second Crusade produced nothing that lasted. The Third Crusade produced a negotiated access to Jerusalem for Christian pilgrims, but not the city itself, not the letters promise. The Fourth Crusade produced the sack of Constantinople. The letters of the First Crusade, the letters home from Jerusalem, had described a victory so complete, so hoy, so evidently God's will, that they made it impossible to accept the losses that came after, made it impossible to say, we tried, we succeeded once. The world has changed. Perhaps this is enough. The letters had described a sacred obligation. Sacred obligations do not expire. Sacred obligations do not negotiate with outcomes. Sacred obligations send another generation east, and another, until the 4th generation sacks the wrong city, and the letter that asked for soldiers has its final answer. The mechanism this episode has examined has a name. It is called amplification. Amplification is what happens when a message moves from its origin through a network to audiences larger than intended, and when each stage of that movement adds something: emphasis, interpretation, urgency, the specific needs of each new set of readers, so that by the time the message reaches its outer audience, it carries more weight, more specificity, more emotional charge than it was sent with. Alexios, I wrote a letter. It was a measured, diplomatic document. It was amplified through translation, through summary, through the specific political context of Urban Day, into a call for holy war. Urban II gave a speech and was designed for a specific audience, the lords of France, the senior clergy of Western Christendom. It was amplified through preaching, through rumor, through the specific religious culture of late 11th century Europe, into a mass movement that included tens of thousands of people. Urban II had not been addressing and could not have intended to reach. The crusading movement produced letters home from the Holy Land. Those letters were designed for specific recipients, families, patrons, ecclesiastical superiors. They were amplified through public reading, through chronicle, through the construction of the official history of the First Crusade into a founding mythology that sent 3 more generations east in pursuit of what the letters described. At every stage, amplification. At every stage, the message acquiring properties that the original sender did not put into it. At every stage, the gap between intention and reception widening. This is not a medieval problem. This is not a problem that has been solved by the development of better communication technology. Better communication technology does not reduce amplification. It accelerates it. The specific features of the Crusades' mechanism of amplification are worth naming precisely because they appear in recognizable form in every subsequent era's version of the same problem. Feature 1. The message is addressed to one audience, but received by many. Alexios wrote to Urban II. Urban II preached to the lords of France. The lords of France told their households. The households told their villages. The villages told the people who joined the People's Crusade and died in Anatolia. At no point in this chain did anyone intend to reach the people at the end of it. At no point did Alexios, or Urban II, or the preaching clergy specifically design their communications for the full range of people who ultimately received them. The message found audiences it was not looking for, and those audiences responded in ways that the message's designers could not predict and could not control. Feature 2. Each intermediary adds something. The translators added urgency. The summarizers added emphasis. Urban II added theological framework. The preachers added personal conviction. The chroniclers added narrative structure. The letters home added sanctity. Each addition was made by someone who believed, who was simply transmitting the message, who was not conscious of adding anything, who was doing their job as they understood it. No single intermediary bears full responsibility for the full amplified message. Each one contributed a small amount to a total that none of them designed. This is perhaps the most important feature, the one that makes amplification so difficult to address. When everyone has added only a little, when no one person has done anything clearly wrong, accountability is distributed across the entire network. And distributed accountability is, in practical terms, almost the same as no accountability. Feature 3. The amplified message outlives the ability of the original sender to correct it. Alexios could not recall his letter. Urban II could not ungive his speech. The crusading leaders could not unwrite their letters home. Once amplified, a message exists in its amplified form in the minds and records of every person who received it, and correcting it requires reaching every one of those people in whatever form the amplification has already taken, and replacing it with something that has to work against the momentum of what is already believed. This is why corrections almost never work, as well as the original message, why retractions rarely travel as far as the story, why the amplified version of a message tends to persist long after the original sender has clarified, qualified, or retracted. The message is already in the minds of the audience. It is already shaping what the audience will do next. The correction arrives late, to a smaller audience, with less force. Urban II died before he could correct anything. Alexios lived to manage consequences, but could not undo them. The message was already running. The Crusades produced one of the most durable narratives in the history of Western civilization. The narrative of the Holy War. The war fought not for territory or economic interest, but for God, for the defense of the faith, for the liberation of a sacred place, entered the cultural vocabulary of the West through the letters and chronicles of the First Crusade. It has never entirely left. The specific theology of holy war, the idea that violence can be sanctified by the righteousness of its cause, that God endorses the military actions of the community that serves him, was not invented by the Crusades. It predates them in both Christian and Islamic tradition, but the Crusades gave it a specific form, a specific vocabulary, a specific set of images and associations. Jerusalem, the Holy Sepulchre, the cross as a military standard that have been drawn on, adapted, transformed, and misapplied in Western culture ever since. The Crusades gave the West a template for the righteous war, and templates, as this series has shown repeatedly, are more durable than the specific contexts that produced them. Geoffrey of Monmouth's prophecy template outlasted Merlin. The donation of Constantine's authority template outlasted Constantine. The blood libel's scapegoat template outlasted the Black Death. The Maleus Maleficarum's procedure template outlasted Kramer. The Crusades' Holy War template has outlasted the Crusades. It is still available. It is still legible. It is still recognizable as a template and therefore still usable as a template by anyone who needs to frame a conflict in the specific terms of sacred obligation versus existential threat. The letter is still in circulation, in its amplified form, in the form it took as it passed through Urban II and the chronicles and the letters home. Not the original, the amplification, which is the only form in which it ever existed from most of the people who have been shaped by it. Alexios I wrote a letter asking for soldiers. The letter was read by someone who needed it to ask for something else. An army was assembled. Oaths were sworn. Letters were sent home. The letters were read by people who needed the crusade to be holy. The crusade went on 3 more times, for 2 more centuries, until one crusade sacked the city. The first letter was written to save. Nobody planned this. Nobody intended this. Nobody, at any single point in the chain of messages and readings and amplifications, made a decision that they believed was wrong. Each person read what they received. Each person transmitted what they understood. Each person acted on the message as they had received it, amplified, shaped, filtered through their own needs, and produced a consequence that no one had designed. The mechanism does not require malice. The mechanism does not require a conspiracy or a forger or a deliberate lie. The mechanism requires only a miss, a network, a reader who is not the intended reader, and a need, the specific human need, to hear in a message what you need to hear that is more powerful than whatever the message was actually sent to say. Alexios's letter still exists, in the form it took as it passed through history, in the only form most people will ever know it, the amplified form, the form shaped by every reader's need, the form that launched 4 crusades, the form that burned Constantinople, not the letter he wrote, the letter that was read. Those are never exactly the same thing.